warm jollof rice bowl, a piece of grilled chicken, green tea in a dented thermos. She worked 14-hour shifts. Sometimes she went to bed hungry, so he wouldn't have to. But she never missed a morning. Snow, humidity, deep fatigue. Chioma still knelt on that cold sidewalk, because to the rest of Seoul, he was just a stain on the concrete. But to her, he was a human being. Then, one Tuesday, 5 black SUVs screeched to a halt outside her employer's gate. Immaculate suits, cold stares. The most feared mafia boss in the country stepping out in a storm of power. And the only thing he did was bow until his forehead nearly touched the ground. That's when Chioma realized the beggar she had been protecting was the man who owned the city. Hello, fam. Welcome to Afro Underworld Mafia Stories. Subscribe now and join us on this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to also comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's proceed with the story. Her name was Chioma Naji, 24, Nigerian, a ghost in a city of neon lights, working as a live-in maid for a family that didn't know her last name. A tiny room in the basement with no windows, passport locked in her employer's safe, debts piling up back in Lagos. Every one mattered. Every grain of rice mattered. But every morning at 6 a.m., at the bus stop outside the gated community, sat Oh Ji-hoon, 72, Korean, invisible, wrapped in a tattered wool coat. Sitting on a flattened cardboard box, whispering warnings about the shadows that no one cared to hear. Most people looked at their phones to avoid his eyes. Chioma almost did too. Until one morning, she decided that being a stranger in a strange land was no excuse for a cold heart. She handed him a thermos, and without knowing it, that single act of mercy would ignite a war that would bring the most powerful syndicate in Korea to its knees. The 5 a.m. alarm was a rhythmic, shivering cruelty, but Chioma Naji was already awake, her breath blooming in the cold air of her windowless basement room. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, knowing that if she woke her employers, she would face a barrage of insults before her shift even officially began. Every one she earned was accounted for, sent home to Lagos to pay for her younger brother's schooling, or tucked away to settle the debts that kept her passport locked in a safe upstairs. Yet, even in the leanest weeks, she found enough to fill a dented thermos with green tea and pack a warm bowl of jollof rice, the spicy aroma of home offering a fleeting comfort in the gray Seoul dawn. Walking toward the bus stop, the city felt like a vast, neon labyrinth designed to make people like her feel small. But at the edge of the gated community, beneath a flickering streetlight, sat the one person who made the world feel human again. Oh Ji-hoon was 72, a man composed of deep wrinkles and a tattered wool coat, seated on a flattened cardboard box that served as his throne. Most residents of the high-rise apartments clutched their designer bags tighter and stared at their phones as they hurried past him, but Chioma always stopped. "You are early today, little bird," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement as he reached out with trembling, grateful hands for the thermos. Chioma knelt on the cold concrete, ignoring the dampness seeping into her light blue uniform. As he ate, they shared stories of their different worlds. She spoke of the vibrant, chaotic markets of Nigeria and the warmth of the sun that felt a lifetime away. He spoke of a soul that no longer existed, whispering strange, fragmented warnings about the shadows that governed the city's heart. He told her that true power didn't live in the skyscrapers, but in the silence of those who observed them from the gutter. To Chioma, he was a grandfather figure in a land where she had no family. She didn't know that she was the only person he spoke to, or that his exile of humility was a deliberate test of the city's soul. She simply saw a hungry man who needed mercy, never guessing that this simple morning ritual was being watched from the tinted windows of black SUVs idling just out of sight, or that her kindness was the only thing preventing a storm from breaking over the city. The following week, the silence of the early morning felt heavier, as if the very air was watching her. Chioma adjusted the strap of her bag, the dented thermos clinking softly against the food container, but her eyes weren't on the path ahead. They were fixed on the rearview mirror of a sleek black sedan idling at the end of the block. It was the third time she had seen it in 4 days. The windows were tinted to a deep, impenetrable obsidian, reflecting the cold streetlights of Seoul like the eyes of a predator. Each time she turned a corner, the low hum of an engine followed at a distance. A cold prickle of dread crawled up her spine, settling in her chest. To a woman living in the shadows of a foreign city, a black car followed by silence only meant one thing: the authorities. Chioma's mind raced through a list of terrors. Had the immigration office flagged her visa? Was her employer's threat to report her finally coming true? She imagined a hand on her shoulder, a cold cell, and the long, lonely flight back to Lagos, with nothing but the shame of failure in her pockets. She walked faster, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every time she reached the bus stop, the sedan would pull over a block away, sitting motionless while she knelt to serve Oh Ji-hoon. She tried to keep her hands steady as she poured the tea, but the porcelain lid rattled against the cup. She was so consumed by the fear of being hunted by the law that she didn't notice the way the old man's eyes flickered toward the car, not with fear, but with a sharp, commanding recognition. "You are shaking, little bird," Ji-hoon said softly, his gaze returning to her face with a strange, protective intensity. "The wind is cold, but some shadows are just waiting for the right moment to step into the light." Chioma didn't understand his riddles. She only knew that the dark cars were drawing closer every day, and she was certain that her time in this city was running out. She didn't realize that the men in those cars weren't looking for a worker without a permit. They were looking for a queen who didn't yet know she had been chosen. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a coming storm, as Chioma knelt by the bus stop. She was tucking a fresh blanket around Ji-hoon's knees, her light blue uniform damp from the morning mist. They were laughing quietly over a story about a stubborn goat in her village when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. The distant hum of the city was swallowed by a coordinated, predatory growl. 5 black SUVs rounded the corner in perfect formation, their tires screeching as they performed an aggressive, synchronized halt that boxed in the bus stop. The doors swung open simultaneously. Men in identical charcoal suits and dark sunglasses stepped out, creating a living wall that blocked the street. Chioma's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. In this city, she had learned that a group of men in suits usually meant trouble for someone without a passport. Instinct took over. She didn't run. Instead, she stepped in front of the seated old man, spreading her arms wide to shield him. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling but firm. "He is just an old man. He hasn't done anything. If it is about the cardboard, I will move it. Please, don't hurt him." The wall of bodyguards parted. From the center vehicle stepped Jang Min-sok. He was a pillar of cold, immaculate power, his black tie straight as a blade. Every step he took toward them felt like a heartbeat of impending doom. Chioma squeezed her eyes shut for a second, bracing for a blow or a shouted command, her body tensed to take whatever violence was intended for the beggar. She heard the heavy click of expensive leather shoes stop inches from the cardboard box, but the strike never came. Instead, there was a profound, suffocating silence. Chioma opened her eyes and choked back a sob of confusion. The most feared man in Seoul, a man whose face signaled the end of lives, wasn't looking at her with anger. He wasn't looking at her at all. Jang Min-sok had lowered his head. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, he bent his body into a deep, 90-degree bow. Behind him, as if pulled by a single string, the entire crew of bodyguards followed suit, their heads bowed in absolute, terrified reverence toward the man sitting on the trash-strewn sidewalk. The silence that followed Jang Min-sok's arrival was heavy, a suffocating pressure that seemed to stop the very wind. Chioma stood frozen, her small frame positioned like a shield between the wall of black-suited men and the frail old man on the cardboard box. She expected violence. She expected the shadows Ji-hoon had whispered about to finally swallow them both. But the violence never came. Instead, the most feared man in Seoul, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless control, came to a halt exactly 3 paces away. He didn't look at Chioma with the disdain she was used to from the wealthy. He didn't even look at her with curiosity. His eyes were fixed entirely on the beggar. With a slow, deliberate movement, Min-sok reached behind him. One of the bodyguards immediately stepped forward, handing him a long, heavy coat made of midnight black cashmere, the gold buttons catching the dim morning light. Min-sok didn't bark an order. He simply waited. Then, the impossible happened. Oh Ji-hoon, the man who had spent months trembling over a thermos of tea, began to rise. The shakiness in his hands vanished. His spine, once curved like a weathered bow, straightened with a sickeningly familiar authority. He didn't look like a beggar anymore. He looked like a king returning from a long journey. Min-sok stepped forward and draped the $5,000 coat over the old man's shoulders. As the heavy fabric settled, the Mafia boss retreated a step and sank into a deep, formal bow, a 90-degree angle of absolute submission. "The car is ready, father," Min-sok said, his voice echoing in the empty street. "The board is waiting. Your exile is over." Ji-hoon ran a hand over the fine lapel of his coat, then turned his gaze toward Chioma. The tired, foggy eyes she knew were gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing intelligence that saw everything. He looked at the dented thermos still in her hand, then back at his son. "Wait," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice no longer a whisper, but a rumble of thunder. He pointed a steady finger at Chioma, who was trembling in her light blue uniform. "This one stays with me. She is the only person in this city who saw a man instead of a ghost." The world Chioma knew had ended. The invisible man was the master of the shadows, and for the first time in her life, the girl who was always ignored was the only one the shadows wanted to protect. The air inside the Kang estate had curdled. Since the morning the black SUVs had descended upon the neighborhood, Chioma's employers, Mr. and Mrs. Park, had moved through the house like cornered animals. They didn't see a maid anymore. They saw a witness. They had watched from their balcony as the city's most dangerous men bowed to a beggar, and they knew Chioma was the link. Panic, fueled by their own shady offshore dealings and a desperate need to silence her before she became someone, led them to a coward's resolution. "Chioma, get up here now!" Mrs. Park's voice shrieked through the intercom, vibrating with a jagged, artificial edge. Chioma wiped her hands on her light blue apron and hurried upstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found them in the master suite, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and rot, Mr. Park stood by the window, his back turned, while his wife stood over an open vanity drawer, her face a mask of rehearsed horror. "My diamond tennis bracelet, the one from the Busan auction." "Mrs." Park gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the empty velvet slot. "It was here this morning. You were the only one in this room, Chioma." "Ma'am, I haven't touched your jewelry." "I was cleaning the terrace," Chioma said, her voice steady but her soul sensing the trap closing. "We'll see about that," Mr. Park muttered, finally turning around. His eyes were cold, devoid of the casual indifference he usually showed her. "I've already called the police. They're waiting at the gate. If you return it now, perhaps we can be lenient." Before Chioma could protest, Mrs. Park stormed toward the basement stairs, leading a path straight to Chioma's tiny, windowless room. They didn't search. They went directly to the thin mattress. With a violent tug, Mrs. Park flipped the bedding, and a shimmering gold chain set with brilliant stones clattered onto the concrete floor. The silence that followed was heavy with betrayal. Chioma stared at the jewelry, a piece of gold that cost more than her family's home in Lagos, and realized the Parks weren't just firing her, they were burying her. As the heavy boots of the officers echoed down the hallway, Chioma realized her kindness to a man on a cardboard box had ignited a fire, and her employers were determined to let her burn in it. The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed with a sterile, aggressive energy that made Chioma's head throb. She sat on a cold metal bench, her wrists small and vulnerable in heavy steel handcuffs. Across from her, a detective tapped a pen against a folder containing the jewelry her employers had planted in her small basement room. To the officers in the room, she was just another migrant worker caught stealing from the hand that fed her a predictable story with a predictable ending: deportation or prison. "Sign the confession, Chioma," the detective muttered, his voice dripping with bored disdain. "Make it easy on yourself. You're a ghost in this country. Nobody is coming for you." Chioma looked down at her hands. She felt the crushing weight of her own invisibility. Her employers had laughed as she was led away, their faces twisted in a triumph that felt like a death sentence. She thought of her family in Lagos, of the brother who would have to drop out of school, and of Oh Ji-hoon, who was likely sitting alone at the bus stop, wondering where his tea was. She felt smaller than she ever had, a single grain of sand being ground down by the gears of a cold machine. Then, the heavy double doors of the precinct swung open with a force that made the front desk sergeant jump. The chaotic noise of the station, the ringing phones, the shouting, the clacking keyboards died instantly. A phalanx of men in charcoal gray suits marched into the room, their presence so dominant it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the hallway. At the center was a man clutching a leather briefcase, his eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses, sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a god of the courtroom. "Who are you?" the detective stammered, standing up. "I am the lead counsel for the Jang Syndicate," the lawyer replied, his voice a calm, terrifying silk that echoed off the tile walls. He didn't look at the detective. He looked directly at Chioma. "And you are currently detaining a protected associate of our chairman. You have exactly 60 seconds to remove those cuffs before we begin the process of dismantling your careers." The silence that followed was absolute. Chioma watched, breathless, as the detective's face turned from arrogant to ashen. The ghost was no longer alone. The neon hum of the police station was a jagged contrast to the silence of the basement room Chioma had called home. She sat on a cold metal bench, her wrists thin and trembling, while her employer, Mrs. Park, paced the linoleum floor like a predator. Mrs. Park's voice was a shrill weapon, painting a picture of a thieving immigrant who had repaid years of generosity by stealing a diamond heirloom. The officers looked on with bored, cynical eyes, already reaching for the deportation paperwork. Chioma lowered her head, the weight of 1,000 miles and a locked passport crushing her spirit. She had no witnesses, no status, and in this bright, sterile room, she was once again invisible. Then, the heavy double doors of the precinct swung open with a force that stilled the room. The air pressure seemed to shift as a phalanx of men in dark suits stepped inside, moving with a synchronized, lethal grace. At their center walked a man who commanded the very molecules of the air. He was draped in a hand-tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair swept back with aristocratic precision, and his jawline set in a mask of absolute authority. Mrs. Park gasped, her tirade dying in her throat as she recognized the face of a man whose shadow governed the city's economy. But Chioma's heart stopped for a different reason. She stared at the man's eyes, the same soft, ancient eyes that had looked at her from behind a tattered wool coat every morning at 6 a.m. "The girl did not take the stone," the man said, his voice no longer a dry rustle of leaves, but a deep, resonant bell that brooked no argument. "Chairman O?" the lead detective stammered, standing at immediate attention. "Sir, this is a minor domestic theft." "It is a crime," Oh Ji-hoon corrected, stepping toward Chioma. He reached out a clean, manicured hand and placed it gently on her shoulder, a gesture of public protection that made Mrs. Park turn ash-gray. "But the criminal is the woman standing by your desk." "I was there," sitting on my cardboard throne, when she slipped that diamond into Chioma's bag. I have spent months as a ghost in your streets, witnessing the rot in your hearts. But in this daughter of Nigeria, I found the only soul in Seoul worth saving. Jihoon looked down at Chioma, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. The beggar was gone, replaced by a king, and the shadows he had once warned her about were now standing at his back, ready to dismantle the world of those who had dared to mistreat the only person who had seen him when he was invisible. The heavy double doors of the penthouse office didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. Chioma stood beside Jang Min-sok, her hand resting on the sleeve of his dark wool coat. She felt the eyes of her former employers, Mr. and Mrs. Park, snap toward her. They were seated behind a desk of polished obsidian, their faces pale, the air in the room thick with the scent of expensive lilies and desperate fear. Only days ago, they had stood in this same room planting jewelry in her bag, mocking her accent, and threatening her with a life behind bars. "What is the meaning of this, Mr.?" Park stammered, his voice cracking as he looked not at Chioma, but at the wall of black-suited men standing silently behind the Mafia boss. "This is a private firm. You can't just—" "Silence," Min-seok said. The word was not a shout. It was a cold, absolute command that sucked the oxygen from the room. He didn't look at them. He pulled out a chair for Chioma, gesturing for her to sit in the center of the room, the position of power they had always denied her. Min-seok placed a thin silver flash drive on the desk. "My father, O Ji-hoon, has spent the last 6 months sitting outside your gate. You treated him like a shadow, like a nuisance. In doing so, you forgot that shadows see everything. This drive contains the ledger of your offshore accounts, the tax evasion you thought was buried, and the footage of you planting that necklace in this young woman's belongings." Mrs. Park's hand went to her throat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The arrogance that had defined her for years vanished, replaced by the hollow stare of the defeated. "The Jang Syndicate does not negotiate with thieves who hide behind silk ties," Min-seok continued, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. "You have 1 hour to sign over your assets to the foundation Chioma will be leading. After that, you will retire. Not to a villa, but to the obscurity you tried to force upon my father." Chioma looked at the couple. For months, she had trembled in their presence, but now, seeing them reduced to trembling wrecks, she felt only a profound, quiet clarity. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the witness to their end. As Min-seok leaned down to whisper a final message of retirement in Mr. Park's ear, Chioma stood up, her light blue uniform replaced by the dignity of a woman who had finally been seen. She walked out of the office without looking back, the sound of her footsteps echoing like the closing of a tomb. Exactly 1 year had passed since the morning the black SUVs had descended upon the sidewalk, shattering the illusion of Chioma's invisibility. Today, the Seoul skyline glowed with a different kind of light. Chioma Naji stood in a high-rise office that overlooked the very bus stop where she had once knelt in the cold. She was no longer wearing the light blue polyester of a servant. Instead, she wore a sharp, cream-colored blazer that complemented her dark skin, her hair styled in an elegant, confident crown. Yet, as she looked down at the street, her eyes held the same warmth they had when she was just a girl with a dented thermos. The office was the headquarters of the Ji-hoon Foundation. On the mahogany desk behind her sat a framed photo of Oh Ji-hoon, not in a tattered coat, but in the immaculate suit he had worn on the day he reclaimed his throne. He had passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind a legacy that was now Chioma's to guard. The foundation didn't just provide meals, it provided dignity. It was a shield for the thousands of ghost workers, the maids, the delivery drivers, and the elderly who kept the city running while the world looked the other way. A soft knock came at the door, and Jang Min-seok stepped inside. The Mafia boss, whose name still made the corrupt tremble, stood before her with a respect that was no longer born of his father's command, but of Chioma's own strength. "The final grants for the new community kitchens have been approved," he said, his voice unusually quiet. My father was right about you. You saw what he was when even I had forgotten how to look. Chioma turned away from the window, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She thought of her former employers, who were now facing the cold reality of the legal consequences Ji-hoon had set in motion. And she thought of her family in Lagos, now living in the safety she had once only dreamed of. But mostly, she thought of the morning ritual that started it all. She had proven that the most powerful thing in a city built of stone and steel was a single, selfless act of mercy. No one in Seoul was invisible anymore, because Chioma was finally watching over them all.